Well, good morning, English 3 classes. I've certainly missed seeing you in class these past couple weeks. I do look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow when we have our first live class session on Zoom. We're going to be, going through The Great Gatsby next, which is one of my favorite American novels. And I think we'll find that there is a lot of interesting material in The Great Gatsby to discuss. Before we dive into The Great Gatsby, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about this book. Because we did not get our chance to have our final discussion on All Quiet on the Western Front, which I was really bummed about. But I wanted to kind of talk about some of the things that happened the last couple chapters here to give some measure of finality to the book before we completely move on to The Great Gatsby. So last time we talked about All Quiet on the Western Front, and I know this was about a month ago at this point, so we'll do a bit of a review. Last time we talked about All Quiet on the Western Front, we were looking at the scene in the crater with Paul and the soldier he killed. We were talking about the focusing question of All Quiet on the Western Front. The question of how can you overcome the isolation and loss of humanity that comes in modern warfare. And as we were looking at that with the soldier, we talked about how we were seeing a possible solution, that perhaps by recognizing the humanity of your enemy, you can recover the isolation, loss of humanity, because we lose our own humanity only when we forget someone else's humanity. And thus by remembering the humanity of someone else, we can remember our own humanity as well. And if this were a perhaps simpler book, that would be where the story would end. We would end with, Paul realizes he just needs to recognize the humanity of his opponent. He lives out that experiment, living consistently. The war ends. He retains his humanity. He goes home, lives a great life with his family and friends. But of course, since you've read the book at this point, you know that is not how this book ends, because Remarque is trying to be an honest storyteller. Sometimes being an honest storyteller means that stories don't get simple endings. And one of the big questions that the book leaves behind with us is, has Paul retained his humanity by the end of the book? Because there's a case you can make for either end. It's certainly possible to interpret the story as saying that yes, there is a solution to this problem, because when he's when Paul's in the crater, he's able to remember, kind of retain a sense of humanity. And if you follow him afterward, well, we see that there are a lot of seems like he's finding more joy in life. You've got the scene in the abandoned village, which is one of my favorite scenes, where you have bombs flying all around them and they're racing from side to side in the house, not just to save themselves but to save the bacon that they're cooking on the stove, because you got to save your bacon. So we've got the fun scenes of them just being in the abandoned house, trying to just save the bacon literally, and cook their pigs and their pancakes. Even in the hospital, we can see a certain amount of joy and vitality with Paul and his comrades. They seem to be able to make the best of the situation. And so it's certainly possible to look at the end of the book and say that yes, this is a, as much as, this kind of book can be, it's a happy ending because Paul's understood the truth. He's living by the right experiment in living, and even while he dies at the end of the book, he dies having returned to his own sense of humanity. Okay? So you could certainly make the case for Paul retaining his humanity at the end of the book. That being said, you can also make a case in the other direction, particularly if you look at the past couple chapters. In chapter 11, we get the death of Kat, and when Kat dies, we don't really get much of a reaction from Paul here. He says, I let them move around and turn myself with them. One circle I stand in the midst. All is as usual. Only the militiaman Stanislaus Kaczynski has died, and then I know nothing more. Only the militiaman Kaczynski has died. Only my best friend. Some of this is, most likely this is just the shock of grief. He hasn't had time to process it. But in the shock of grief, we're kind of seeing him, returning to, well, it's just another death. It doesn't really matter, because it's hard to care about the value of life on the battlefield when you're constantly taking it. This despair continues into chapter 12. All right, I want to read you what he says in chapter 12. He says that had we returned home in 1916, out of the suffering and the strength of our experience, we might have unleashed a storm. But now, if we go back, we will be weary, broken, burnt out, rootless, and without hope. We will not be able to find our way once more, and men will not understand us. For the generation that grew up before us, though it has passed these years with us, already has a home and a calling. Now it will return to its old occupations, and the war will be forgotten. And the generation that has grown up after us will be strange to us and push us aside. We will be superfluous even to ourselves. We will grow older. A few will adapt themselves. Some others will merely submit, and most will be bewildered. The years will pass by, and in the end we shall fall into ruin. This isn't the joy of a man who's found how he can maintain his humanity on the course of the battlefield. This is someone who says, the war has ruined me. And, we dreamed at one point of revolution. We dreamed of, doing something better, making the world a better place when we go home. But he says, now we're husks of the men we once were. And we won't be understood. And there's this deep loneliness of knowing that people won't understand what you've been through. We don't really get the sense here that this is a happy ending or even bittersweet for Paul here. And the final piece that you could also argue points to just his lack of an answer to the problems of war is the last paragraph. The last two paragraphs, where we learn about Paul's death, tells us that he fell in October 1918, on a day that was so quiet and still on the whole front that the army report confined itself to a single sentence, all quiet on the Western Front. And there, of course, we get the deep irony of the name of the book. A man has died, a life, all is quiet. Nothing than this paragraph, the final paragraph of the book. It says that Paul had fallen forward and lay on the earth as though sleeping. Turning him over, one saw that he could not have suffered long. His face had an expression of calm, as though almost glad the end had come. We kind of get this notion here that what is the only answer for these men in these trenches? Well, the only answer to the isolation, the loss of humanity, they feel is death. Because there isn't anything for them in the world anymore. They've lost everything. They've given up everything for the war. So you can certainly argue that the scene in the trenches was a turning point, and that when Paul saw the enemy, he was able to recover some sense of his humanity when we look at how he behaves at the hospital, how he behaves with his friends. But you could also make a very strong case to say that, look, the scene in the crater was a bright spot. It was a glimpse of maybe there's some answer here, but that ultimately, there's also a fair argument to be made that the book's saying that there is no answer, that the isolation and loss of humanity is inevitable with modern warfare, and there isn't a solution. All Quiet on the Western Front has been called several times as one of the greatest war novels of all time. But as we talked about when we did the change my mind exercise for All Quiet, it's also been called the greatest anti-war novel of all time, since there are many people who argue that this book is pushing for some version of pacifism, saying that look, wars just destroy everyone. The only solution is death, and we shouldn't be fighting these wars. And certainly that's sort of an argument. It might make a bit more sense talking about World War I, where there really wasn't a great reason for any of the countries to go to war, and compared to other wars. But that's the paradox. All Quiet on the Western Front leaves us with is it leaves us with the paradox of not really knowing how whether or not Paul succeeded, not giving a clear answer to the focusing question. There's a part of me that wants to say that the book is saying that we just need to recognize the humanity of our enemies and that there is a solution there. That's the optimistic, hopeful part of me. There's also the more cynical part of me that says that no, the book is suggesting that there isn't an answer. And it's a dichotomy we have to hold in check. So I'll let you think for yourselves about which interpretation of the story you think is most plausible, what the story is trying to say with regards to its focusing question. If you look on Google Classrooms in the homework document, we've given you one last reflection question for this book. And beginning tomorrow, we'll begin into The Great Gatsby, a time of parties, a time of the Roaring '20s, and on the surface, not as much suffering. but we'll see how much is lurking beneath the surface of the Great Gatsby. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. I hope you have a lovely rest of your days. And class is dismissed.